Morning, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity. I'm located in Canada. I'm in Alberta. I work for the federal government, Environment Canada and Climate Change with the Canadian Wildlife Service, so the Canadian equivalent of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I work as a funding coordinator, so the way I'm going to approach, I guess what I want to offer this morning is, as a funding coordinator on behalf of the federal government, I get to work with some of the other sectors, or most of the other sectors involved in this initiative. And I learned a lot as a funding coordinator and from my colleagues that I want to convey here, I guess, as we go through the roadmap. So the way I've prepared for this is I've looked at the different priority headings and tried to pull out some keywords and then some thoughts on some of those key messages for each of the priorities, and I'll try to quickly go through those. So I'm going to start with the partnerships and engagement priority. The things that really jumped out from me on the roadmap right now are sustained engagement, the idea of collaboration and coordination among diverse stakeholders. And thoughts there, I wanted to point out that few sponsoring organizations actually fund that kind of collaboration as a dedicated activity in its own right. We often see that wrapped into more tangible conservation projects. We fund projects, one at a time, and maybe at the expense of really investing in long-term collaboration, coordination that those projects really should unfold in the context of. And that's maybe a change in mindset that we might need to see in order to enable some of the things that we have in the roadmap right now. It's a bit of a challenge for us as a federal government. It's just our funding rules essentially don't allow that in most cases. So we have to find pretty innovative ways of trying to fund that. In terms of policy, the things that jumped out here for me were the economic resiliency theme, human well-being, and the idea of linking that to measurable conservation outcomes and voluntary incentive-based approaches, and a pretty strong focus on that so far in the roadmap on incentive-based approaches, which can be a bit of a challenge actually for project sponsors. So I wanted to point out that I think from a policy perspective, we'll want to sort out perceived versus real conflicting incentives. We have, we're told pretty strong incentives for intensification of land use to support producers who prefer maybe a high risk, high yield approach to using the land base, as opposed to less intensive users like grazers, right? That might have a lower risk, but also lower yields, and there may be a competitive issue here. So that's important for us to sort out as sort of the background in which the idea of direct payments and incentive-based approaches should probably work out. So a policy mix here of looking at what our existing policy suite is for supporting agriculture, trying to level the playing field between different types of producers, especially the producers that are in a position to really get good conservation outcomes through things like low intensity grazing and things like that. It's going to be really important. And then of course we can stack other programming for getting conservation on top of that. But I wanted to point that out, that I don't think it can be all about incentive-based approaches. I think we need to be judicious to make sure the limited conservation dollars for incentives go as far as they can by making sure that we're setting up sustainable and cost-effective programs. The final thought, and that relates to funding as well, research and evaluation. The keywords that jumped out here, I'm kind of synthesizing, but to me, I think there's a call for evidence-based approaches here. Evidence for public benefit of grassland conservation, which is going to hopefully, directly feed into the arguments for why we need an enhanced investment in a lot of the things that are identified in the roadmap. But we really need to sell this on an evidence base, and I think that's coming out strongly. The idea of data comparability, information sharing, obviously, is really important. But I think one of the things that's a real strength is the social and environmental science components being combined here to a significant degree. It's just great to see a strong linkage between social and environmental science together, because what works, on paper, based on theory, based on science, may have no uptake at the ranch or farm gate, right? So understanding the interplay of all of those things and the social science and economics, as well as the sort of the more pure science on what wildlife needs and those sort of things, is going to be really key. And finally, what I noticed in discussion around the monitoring programs, especially priority 6, there's a lot to unpack to me in priority 6. It's a list of monitoring questions that are very diverse in terms of scope and scale, and I think a clear categorization of the monitoring and research approaches there and how they vary by scale is going to be really important. And it got me thinking about some of the monitoring theory that Lindenmayer and Likens and others have put together. Might be a useful framework going forward to put some wheels to that part. So that's a quick overview of my initial thoughts. Hopefully it's useful for getting some discussion going. Thanks, Matt.
Great, thank you, Robin. And a couple notes, just even that last one you were looking at, that was one that the facilitation team was revisiting the summaries from the work groups last week and really looking at that one and saying, does that one work? Was that representative of what we talked about? And so I think that that one about monitoring will be a good one for the research and eval work groups tomorrow to look over. And we've made some changes already this week, trying to better represent what we talked about. One other note for other speakers, when we're dealing with live simultaneous interpretation, just as a reminder that acronyms are a challenge, and not everybody who's involved, since we're working with all 8 sectors, necessarily knows what the acronyms are. So the acronyms can be a good moment to slow down and actually spell those out for everybody, and that can be useful as we do multiple languages here and provide the interpretation. So thank you very much again, Robin. And Jerome Ford, I would love to hand it over to you if you're ready to go.
Yes, sir. Can you hear me, Matt?
We can, thank you.
Awesome. Well, definitely thanks, Matt, and for the organization for putting the summit on, my good friend, Ms. Tammy Verkotteren, for inviting me. I'm excited about today. I got up at 4 o'clock this morning and started looking at the roadmap again and looking at notes, and couldn't wait till we got started here today. So what I like to do, but before we do that, again, my name is Jerome Ford. I'm the Assistant Director for Migratory Birds, and I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Washington, D.C. So what I like to do first is kind of give an overview of the service's perspective on the things that we're doing in referencing grassland species, and then I like to transition into some thoughts on the roadmap, if that's okay with everyone. So the grassland conservation has been a focus for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for decades. You know, we've talked about it plenty of times at trilaterals, definitely with Canada and our friends in Mexico, and how we need to progress grassland species. So we've been doing this work for quite some time. Hadn't always got it right, but we're definitely engaged. And through our National Wildlife Refuge System, we own and manage over 4 million acres through the Great Plains states. In the northern tier of the Great Plains, our realty program has secured grassland easements on an additional 1.8 million acres. Now that seems like a lot, and it is when you start comparing that to our National Wildlife Refuge System, but we still have a lot of more work to do, without a doubt. And in each year, interest in grassland easement outpaces our available resources. So we have a waiting list of several hundred landowners, and I guess that's probably a good problem to have. We run out of money, but we still have people who want to participate, so we can kind of work our way through that. On the ground, we have nearly 5 partners for fish and wildlife biologists across the landscape, working with private landowners and our partners to restore approximately 175,000 acres a year in the Great Plains. And our migratory bird program is leading and or supporting several research and monitoring projects for priority grassland birds such as Baird's and grasshopper sparrows, chestnut collared, and McCown's longspur. Now, some of those projects occur on the breeding grounds, funded with our base funding and leverage with partners such as ConocoPhillips and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation funds in partnership with several universities. Other projects on the migration and wintering grounds are supported by base funding again and grants from our Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act grant program, which is affectionately known to some of us as our NIMCA program. Now, our science application program is stepping in to fulfill some of our critical funding needs as well, helping to bring in new capacity and leverage the funds that I mentioned a little bit earlier. The service is supporting, facilitating, or leading several large-scale efforts in grasslands. For example, recently formed pollinator advisory team to guide the service's conservation effort for at-risk and listed pollinators. The Midwest Lands Initiative to serve as a forum for issues facing partners in large landscapes, And 3 of our service regions facilitate the base funding for and are heavily engaged in migratory bird joint ventures partnerships that conserve habitat for the benefit of priority bird species, other wildlife, people across multiple sectors, such as included in this summit. But what we value most in the Fish and Wildlife Service is our partnership. We cannot do this alone. And if you ever heard me speak at the NAPSA meeting or whatever meeting I'm at, there's very few things within our migratory bird program within the Fish and Wildlife Service that we do alone. It's about partners and that collaboration. So every one of our programs work closely in partnership with state, federal, tribal, nonprofit, private landowner, and industry colleagues. And we need to broaden that net even further. An example that you've hopefully heard about leading up to today, the migratory bird joint ventures across the Great Plains are collaborating across their normal boundaries and partnerships in a mega partnership known as the JV8. And that partnership, of course, is focused on grassland conservation for many of the declining grassland birds that are endemic to North America. Partners will help leverage their collective time, treasure, and talent to amplify on-the-ground conservation on working grasslands. There will be, of course, an international focus, but will be tailored fit to accommodate regional and local strengths and issues. So success will come from partnerships as diverse as that we're seeing here in this summit. And I think the golden nugget, again, for me, and one of the takeaways is that partnership piece. We can't do this by ourselves. It takes all of us, I think, on the same sheet of music to make sure that we can get the maximum benefit from the efforts that we're putting forward. And for me, that's kind of a perfect segue to talk about the Grassland roadmap a little bit. I gotta say, I read that document probably 4 or 5 different times, and the very first 2 words of the first paragraph, really resonated with me. Now, I'm an introvert by nature, but I'm a people person as well. I believe in the power of people, and words mean things to people, whether we write them or we're reading them or you're hearing somebody say them. So my approach to the roadmap is going to maybe be a slightly different than most. I'm a biologist, been around doing this work for 30-something years, but it's about people. So the first 2 words in that first paragraph, disparate efforts. Now, what that said to me as a leader in the Fish and Wildlife Service, we identified right up in the bird conservation community that we've done things differently, and perhaps it has not yielded what we were seeking. But if we can be honest with ourselves and we say that up front in this Grassland roadmap, kudos to us. Disparate efforts. So we identify we can perhaps do better and join our forces and have a greater outcome. So that captured me right off the bat. Other words, similar to what Robin did that I saw throughout the document that was very encouraging. Human community health and sustainability. That socioeconomic impacts and benefits, we're people. If we're gonna make a change, it's gotta be the people that do that. The resources depend on us in a very strange way for us to make it better for them. So that's all about people. That's all about the partnerships and the collaboration that I talked about earlier. New strategies. Again, if you've ever heard me speak anywhere, a phrase I like to use, if you always do what you've always done, you will always get what you have always gotten. So just seeing the term new strategies and how people talk about that, that was very energizing to me to realize that we have to do something different, not just for the sake of doing it different, because we have to take a different strategy going back to that disparate efforts that I talked about just moments ago. Other words, again, that excited me, diverse voices, inclusion, indigenous communities, collaborative, unified. That's us, and that's all of us, not a segment of us and the conservation community. That's all of us. So just hearing those things starting out in the first couple paragraphs, looking at the Grassland roadmap, man, I was bought in. I invested. I doubled down on everything I had because I thought this was one of the best conservation documents that I've seen, because not only did it talk about the resources that we know that's important to us, but it has that people flavor, because that's where the change is going to occur. And just before I stop here, I'll talk a little bit about the priorities and things that caught my eye, and I can give a little feedback there. Developing strategies to share resources. Again, that's us coming together. I grew up poor, and to be honest with you, very poor. So money has never meant a whole lot to me, but it is that sense of community and working with people. You get all of us together with a little bit of nickels and dimes and pennies that we have, we can make a change and make a difference in grassland and for the grassland species. It's not always about the funding and the resources. It's about that collaboration and coming together and sharing what you have to make it better. So I look forward to us continuing that. A coordinated delivery mechanism. It's the same thing. I have a little bit, you have a little bit, our neighbor down the street has a little bit. Let's put that together and let's figure out what it is we need to do and make sure it is in coordination, a good strategy, the right methodology to make a change and to move the conservation needle. And I think the roadmap definitely does that. Well, just talk a moment about the North American Grassland Conservation Act, that concept. I'm very interested in that. I hear it may be modeled somewhat after the NACA, the North American Wetlands Conservation Act. That is awesome. But just a little bit of a reality for us, and this is not throwing a wet blanket, but to make sure that we all are aware, you know, money as it moves through this country and through the federal government definitely in the US, there is no new money. So if we got a $5 million initiative to start the North American Grassland Conservation Act, that means $5 million had to come from somewhere else. And all the other stuff that I talk about from the people's perspective, we don't want to hurt someone else to help ourselves. We want to be able to help them too. However, they should be able and be willing to compromise a little bit and to share. So I'd like for us to be careful in how we would move forward with something such as the North American Grassland Conservation Act. But I love the concept, and I think there's definitely a utility for that, and it can grow some legs. And the last thing, such as Matt did, research and evaluation. I'm a biologist, I'm a scientist, definitely believe in research and evaluation. We do what we do based on the best science possible. We definitely can continue that, but we have to be careful that we don't have a lifelong research project. You know, we love researching and asking questions and solving things, but if we definitely can get to some of the short-term concerns and short-term answers as we do our research evaluation, which can propel us into the future and dealing with the issues with the grassland species, I think it's a phenomenal document, the Grassland Roadmap, and I totally support that. And it gets me back to how I started the discussion with the Grassland Roadmap, disparate efforts. We're gonna make that go away, it's gonna fade away, we're gonna all be on the same page, and we're gonna all pull in the same direction. And Matt, that's all I have, and I yield back the balance of my time, sir.
Thank you so much, Jerome. Really, really appreciate it. Both appreciate hearing some of your story and perspective on what you're doing, and then getting to hear the nuts and bolts on the roadmap as well. And glad to hear that the collaboration pieces at the beginning and what the work is being done there, you know, is resonating at this point. And I know the work group's thinking about that. That's one of the questions for tomorrow is, do we have enough in there about collaboration and that process? So I know those groups will be looking closely at those pieces. So thank you for your thoughts. Really appreciate it. Jimmy Bramlett, I'd like to hand it over to you. Thanks for being with us today. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Matt. And it's exciting to follow Jerome after all the discussion about partnerships, and then even Robin and some of his comments as well. But because we have a lot of folks that don't know who I am, or maybe even who NRCS is, just quickly give a brief introduction. My name is Jimmy Bramlett. I'm the Deputy Chief for Programs with NRCS. In that role, basically, I have responsibility for all of our conservation planning activities, all of our program delivery activities. And effectively what that means is that my role is to help bring that science that Jerome talked about in the form of technical assistance to over 2,500 field offices all across the country. And basically what those men in NRCS are doing is they're going out and they're working with those individual landowners one-on-one and trying to help understand what their issues are, what their desires are, look at the resources, the landscape, try to bring to bear some variation of alternatives from the 353 conservation practices, which are based off of research and science, to the solution table and help that landowner meet their objectives. And that's the key, that for us, the landowner is making the decision in the end, which means we're a voluntary organization. So I'm already making a comment about the fact that we provide science-based technical assistance. We're fortunate to have over 4.5 pair investments that are dedicated to conservation. And at the same time, we're allowing that landowner to really make that decision on their own property. And what's so critical about that is landowners comprise over 70% of the land ownership, private landowners that is, of land ownership across the United States. And so literally millions of individuals are making tens of millions of decisions every day about how that resource base is being managed out there across the country. So I got to give kudos to the Bird Conservancy and everybody else who's been part of this process, and the agility that has been exercised in the face of this worldwide pandemic to gather input the way that unfolded right now. The roadmap, I think, is a fascinating document. I agree 100% with Jerome about the collaboration and everything associated with that. And Robin made some comments about sustainability and trying to find that balance between conservation efforts as well as economic viability for individual operations. And from our perspective, what we've experienced over many years is if we have good conservation that also makes good economic sense for that landowner, we're finding much more success in those alternatives that we offer than if we just go in there and say, we really need to do this with a focus on the natural resource base in and of itself. The other part about the early parts of the document, as far as we talked about having a flourishing ecosystem of soil, plants, and NRCS for decades now has had an acronym that we've operated by known as soil, water, air, plants, and animals plus humans, SWAPA plus H as the case has been. So it fits right in very well with what we do, and that part about where it is we want to be. It's common to the mission of NRCS. And then the other part about how is it that we get there goes back to what Jerome was saying. NRCS, even though we have 2,500 field offices, we basically only have about 8,000 employees out there across the landscape. And so we need these kinds of partnerships in order to help deliver conservation with the resources we have available to us. And we've got a lot of experience at the national level with joint ventures at the state level with state foresters, wildlife managers, at the local level with county managers, city managers, and a variety of other NGOs as well. So NRCS can be part. We can't do all of it. No one organization can do all, just as Jerome was saying, but we can be part of this 8 sectors of solution that's identified as part of this roadmap. As far as the priorities are concerned, we think NRCS actually has something to contribute to every one of those. There's 3 of them I really want to highlight here and bring to the forefront. The first is about developing and sharing resources. I mentioned that we have the opportunity to deliver and administer over $4 billion investments for our country. And like Jerome, we have 2, 3, 4 times the demand for those. And so it's critical that we be effective, that we be efficient, that we reach the higher priority bang for buck investments there. Even though we have the 23 programs, we do have a lot of scrutiny about how efficient we are in managing these resources out there. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention one of those in particular. It's the RCPP, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. That program is actually designed for partnerships, much like what we're talking about here today. In that program, we have 2 pots of money. One is at the state level and one is at critical conservation. The law requires that we dedicate half of our funds into the critical conservation area level, and we are limited to only having 8 of those across the country. One of those lines up almost perfectly with the Grassland Conservation Roadmap area of focus. We call it the Prairie Grasslands CCA, Critical Conservation Area. So that announcement for program funding actually is going to come out on Thursday of this week for over $300 million, and the proposals will be due in November. But as you continue to look at this partnership, this landscape, think about that program in ways that that program also gives us an opportunity there as a group. There's elements of that program that are innovation and that help bring the latest science into a way that we can deliver it out there across the landscape with individuals out on a daily basis. Secondly, priority number 5, a coordinated delivery mechanism. So I talked about our local, our delivery system within the federal government, but we also have a statutory requirement to do something we call locally led conservation. And what that means is that we have to invite people, private landowners, those who have interest in natural resource management, those who have interest in agriculture at the lowest level, the county or city level, to give input back to that input then goes to something we call a state technical committee. This is an advisory group that advises our state conservationists how and what they should do to prioritize the delivery of all of our programs. So if you think about the fact that we have this 2,500 field office delivery system, meaning a conservationist is close to you, we have a lot of partners. We're fortunate to have a significant amount of financial assistance available, all in a voluntary fashion, and yet still the local people are telling us as a federal government what those priorities should be. So we think that there's a lot of opportunity to help expand that coordinated delivery all the way down to individual landowners as a part of it. And then finally, the private-public partnerships. What was mentioned in the last priority number 5 was working lands for wildlife. I was actually fortunate to be the person at NRCS when working and developed working lands for wildlife in collaboration with Fish and Wildlife over about a decade ago. It's been a really good example of all of these partnerships all across the various geographic scales, organizational scales, from the federal to the state to the local. And then when we're talking about partnerships at the public-private level, and the other item that was mentioned is outcomes and accountability. We in the NRCS are under a tremendous amount of pressure to demonstrate to Congress, to the White House, to the American taxpayer, what are we getting collectively for these conservation investments? And so this year we've deployed something that we know that we talk about as CART, C-A-R-T, which is Conservation Assessment and Ranking Tool. What this does is it helps bring all the science that we've used in the past to do our conservation planning through various models, put those in 6-part folders, put them away in a file cabinet, is put them in a common frame of reference. And literally this year, we're beginning to collect tens and tens of millions of data points associated with natural resource management. What that'll do is it'll help galvanize the natural resource management research community. We'll bring research and be in a much better position collectively to talk about how effective certain conservation practices are over others, to look at more research for new conservation practices. And again, it's going to require more partnership activities to gather the empirical data, to do the monitoring out there on the landscape. And so it just really helps fold in well with what the conservation grassland roadmap looks like, or central grassland roadmap looks like. And so we're excited to be part of this effort. We think it's a great vision for where you want to go in the future. We look forward to being part of that solution. And so with that, Matt, I'll yield the rest of my time back to you.
Great, thank you so much, Jimmy. Really, really appreciate it. And there was some chat going on about one of the grant programs that you mentioned. I think that the link to that got posted just as a heads up for everybody. So we appreciate you sharing those resources and kind of highlighting some of those things that are out there already. And I think one of the challenges with the roadmap is recognizing both all the great work that's already happening, all the collaborative areas, all the grant programs, all the things that are out there, and then where we need to add, where we need to fill in. And that's a real challenge that we're looking at with all the priorities. So again, thank you for your thoughts. Really appreciate it. Alice Boyle, I'd love to bring you up next if you're ready to go.
Yep.
Great, thank you, Alice.
Can people see that?
Yep.
Okay. My name's Alice Boyle. I'm here representing the academic research community. I'm a professor at Kansas State University, and I'd just like to start by acknowledging that the land where I live and work in Manhattan, Kansas, is the site of Blue Earth Village, primary settlement of the Kaw Nation. And I'm currently speaking to you from Tucson, which is a city built on the traditional lands of the Tohono O'odham Nation. Many thanks to the leaders who invited me to speak today, and I really want to thank all the participants in this process and the diverse voices that we've heard from during the roadmap so far. Muchas gracias a nuestros colegas en México por atender hoy y a esta charla y por su participación en el proceso. Creo que es muy importante tener la perspectiva, ideas, contribuciones de gente que vive por toda la región. Ojalá que vemos aún más participación en las semanas que vienen. I want to start with a tiny bit of background. I grew up in the very northern part of this roadmap area in Winnipeg, northernmost part of the Great Plains. And despite growing up in this prairie biome, if you zoom into Winnipeg, you can see that it's surrounded by this sea of agricultural lands, mainly wheat fields. And my only experience of prairie growing up was this tiny postage stamp little reserve in the city that we went to for field trips growing up. And it completely was unuseful for preparing me for this vision of the roadmap concept, this landscape dominated by grasslands, healthy populations of grassland organisms, and people deriving livelihoods from the health of that ecosystem. Really, my first experience of grasslands came from wanderings in Mexico and grasslands in both southern Mexico, and then later when I was in grad school in Tucson, the grasslands of the borderlands in northern Mexico and Arizona. It wasn't until I moved to Kansas and started a job at Kansas State University that I really learned what prairies were. And I've been working at Kansas State University in the biology department for the last 7 or 8 years. And this region is, I'm incredibly fortunate. I live in this landscape dominated by tallgrass prairie, the last big chunk of tallgrass prairie in North America. And this is a region where the landscape was largely spared from plowing due to the rocky soils, and it's dominated by private lands managed contemporarily for livestock ranching. So I now devote a lot of my research time to trying to understand the factors that affect bird populations in this region and contribute to their conservation. So I'm participating in this process of drafting the roadmap as a representative of the scientific and specifically biological academic research community. So, because what academic researchers do isn't necessarily familiar to everyone, I thought I'd explain sort of what my job is. And although these different components vary from person to person, a large chunk of what we do is research. And that includes mentoring and training of graduate students and doing research through graduate students. But it's a huge part of what I do. It's bigger, theoretically at least, than the teaching component. But then there's this other piece, which is service. And people invent that part in many different ways. And for me, science communication, talking to people across these boundaries between sectors, is really important part of what I do. So I'm here to listen and learn, and I've learned a lot from the speakers that have gone before me and from the workshops that I've participated in, and I look forward to doing more of that. I'm here to contribute understanding of the biological systems, the state of the knowledge, the needs from a biological perspective, and I'm here to try to help shape this future through all three aspects of my job. So as I mentioned before, I've been listening and learning. What I wanted to do in the next few minutes is share some of the insights that we've had through the research that we've done in my group, mostly led by this fantastic group of current and former graduate students that I picture here. And there's sort of three main topics I wanted to talk about. One was movement, dispersal, and migration of these animals. Another one is our research into sort of land use and fragmentation effects, and the other one is climatic drivers of population dynamics. As I'm sure everybody knows here, like, birds make multiple types of movements over their lifetime, and many of our migratory birds do migrations, but they also do other kinds of movements. They move around their home ranges, they make movements from where they were born to where they breed, and then critically, they make these movements between places at different times of their life cycle to breed. And this is a part of movement of grassland birds that differs substantially from the kinds of movements that birds in other areas make. It turns out this part is way more important than we realized before. How do we know this? We know this because we color band birds and we follow them, we recite them, we track them with radio transmitters, we use biochemical signatures in their feathers to figure out where they were last year. We put other types of tracking devices that store information. And then we also use these big citizen science databases that tell us where birds are in different years. So what we've learned is that a lot of the changes in abundance from year to year in one spot might not be due to birds dying or having more or fewer offspring in a year, or it's due to that movement. It's due to them up and moving to a different location and breeding in a different location next year. Another big insight is that even some really small birds seem to need really big areas of grasslands to thrive. So the implications for this is that for many species, it might be better to focus our conservation efforts on fewer, larger areas than smaller, more fragmented pieces of prairie across the landscape. We study sort of the disturbance processes, grazing and fire at local scales and also at slightly bigger scales. And as I'm sure many of you know, these landscapes change dramatically even within one season. If you overlay on that the fire, the grazing, those things interact with the time of year and create this patchiness on the landscape. And that patchiness spatially turns out to be incredibly important for maintaining the full communities of grassland birds. So different species need different things, and even within a species, birds at different stages of their lives, at the nesting stage or at the what they need for foraging varies. What kind of structures and disturbance regimes help make them thrive varies. Overlaid on that, we have an incredibly variable climate in the Great Plains. And this is just a little GIF showing how different deviation from normal precipitation across 5 years. And you can see how in a given location, drought, heavy rain, tremendously variable from year to year. And we're learning that how much rain falls matters an awful lot, but it doesn't matter in a really simplistic kind of way. It's not always more is better in the ways that many people think. And importantly, how an individual, a population is going to respond to that wetter or drier than average conditions depends on where against the background of wet and dry it is. And so we see gradients across this region in what the sort of typical climatic conditions are, from wetter on the east, drier in the west. That's just one of the many gradients. And it matters where you are. And unfortunately, that means that the results of science conducted in one region are not necessarily going to easily translate to another region, which is a challenge for us. Our current work is trying to figure out how that rain matters. How does a wetter, drier than average year translate into more deaths or more births or choices about where to move and where to settle to breed across the year? So some of the implications of this work for the roadmap for bird conservation generally is, some of the messages are good. That mobility means that we have an unprecedented opportunity to do restoration and have birds able to respond to that across this big region. If you build it, they will likely come. That movement, though, really impedes our ability to do monitoring well and to assess the effectiveness of our actions. When you see a decrease in birds locally, it might not have to do specifically with what you are doing on your land. It might have to do with what all your neighbors in the region are doing, or it might have to do with how a much broader scale weather pattern is different in this year or a few years back. So I think another positive thing is that more so in most regions, working lands, it's really needed for conservation. It's not an impediment to conservation. We have this opportunity to integrate our conservation goals and our human goals that are so tightly linked in this process, which is, as many of the other speakers have mentioned, this is something that I think is a real strength of the roadmap. One of the drawbacks of this that I mentioned earlier is that big prairie patches might be harder to locate, to preserve, to restore, to maintain. And then finally, there's this amazing flexibility in behavior in these grassland birds. And we're seeing a lot of their behavioral flexibility buffering them from the kinds of environmental variability and change that we see ongoing in these systems. And that's a good news. But then, as I mentioned, what works in one place isn't necessarily going to work elsewhere, given the background of different climatic conditions across this range. So I just want to spend the last few minutes reflecting on the roadmap as it stands now and the priorities, and specifically focusing on the research component of the roadmap. One theme that for me going in and ongoing is still, I think, one of the biggest themes that I see as something we need to keep focusing on is understanding why, when we see declines, understanding the causes of that. And one question is, what life stage is most in trouble? Is it that nests aren't being successful? Is it that young are not surviving to adulthood? Is it the adults are not surviving better as much as they need to? What times of year and what regions does this happen? Is it mainly a problem that's something we need to address on breeding grounds, or is it something that's mainly a problem on their wintering areas? Is it a lack of adequate habitat during their migrations? And then within those wintering, breeding, migration areas, are there specific areas within that range where populations are doing well and others are doing poorly? If we can identify that, then we can get at the specific local causes and be really targeted in our conservation efforts. And this is, some people I think have been a little unclear about what we mean by bottlenecks. Identifying the locations and time of life that these populations are most limited is identifying those bottlenecks. And without knowing where those bottlenecks are, we're kind of working blind, wasting potentially effort and money, and not achieving the outcomes we want. So another theme is this knowledge sharing. It can be information, it can be metadata, it can be data. This is going to be critical. I've seen a lot of studies in scientific literature where there's duplication of effort, and we don't want to do that. We have to be as targeted as we can and efficient as we can to achieve these really ambitious goals. It'll allow us to standardize best practices and derive information that's comparable. But I think a big part of knowledge sharing for me is really working to increase our communication both within sectors, which I think is relatively easy. It's more easy to talk to our peers than across sectors, which is really quite difficult. We need to identify what information people who are not in our sphere need and figure out how to get that information across those sectors. Another theme is this integration of the human cultural context at all stages of this process. It's clear that we need each other. We need to be willing to learn from one another, and we need to acknowledge the human factors make or break everything that we do here. So I am coming to this humbly and aiming to learn from one another, and I hope we can all do this effectively. It's going to be critical to the success of the project. So what can academic researchers contribute? You know, we spend a lot of time learning how to do science well, how to design studies in a robust way, and data analysis. Research is a big part of our job, core part of our job, maybe more than many of the other sectors in this initiative. So we can do stuff and we can access literature easily. We spend a lot of time trying to write well and clearly. And so we have skills to bring to the table here that I hope can be integrated into this process. And many of us have considerable flexibility in the specifics of what we choose to research and work on. Some of the barriers, though, is that there's often a disassociation between university research and then the on-the-ground needs. And I've been thinking a lot about why this is. It could be that in some cases there's a disconnect between the interests of the academics and the needs of other people. It can sometimes be a function of funding. We can only do things that we can get funding to research. And so sometimes the funding drives the cart. But I think a lot of it has to do with the integration of our professional networks. And I see this roadmap effort as being a great step at breaking down some of those barriers and developing more integration. Another barrier is that there's sometimes lack of respect or trust between academics and people on the ground. And this makes me very sad. And we have to get over that on all sides. Easier said than done, I think, but it happens. And then I'm the first person to acknowledge that academics are not always the best people at translating the insights of what they do to diverse audiences. It's something I work hard at, but it's something that I know that we all need to do better at. So a few final thoughts. As we move into working groups again in the next week, there are a lot of priorities there on that roadmap, and many are still at this very high level. And some of the things that I am concerned about is how do we prioritize among these really different types of priorities? They're all important. How do we say this kind of research about biological systems is any more or less important than this kind of research about the social barriers to adoption, for instance? And how do we turn these really big ideas into actionable tasks? Participation across sectors, something I've harped on. I think listening well is hard. I think working together is even harder. So we can't listen if people aren't at the table, so we need to have this continued participation from multiple sectors. But we have to go beyond listening and speaking. We have to figure out how to go beyond that in the next phases. And then how can we best achieve these research goals? How do we go from priorities to outcomes? How do we match opportunities to funding dollars? And how do we ensure the appropriate scales, geographic coverages? So I'll leave it at that. I hope I haven't gone over. Thank you for listening.
Alice, we really appreciate it. You've got a tough job because we've asked you to speak. You're also on the planning committee for this, and you've dove into the delegate work group. So really appreciate all your thinking and a lot of great framing, both high level and down in the work that we need to think about for tomorrow. So thank you again for your work here. Really appreciate it. I'd like to bring up Carter Smith now. And Carter, if you're ready to go, we will bring you in.
I am, Matt. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you great. Thanks, Carter.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Matt. Good morning, everybody. For those of you I don't know, I'm Carter Smith, and I'm the executive director with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. And so delighted to be with all of you. Honored to be part of this speaker group and panel. I certainly want to echo the sentiments of the other speakers and just share my gratitude to all of you who have been working on this roadmap. We see real relevancy and application to this effort to help really emphasize just and reinforce the salience of these grassland habitats and landscapes and how important they are to our future, both to human and natural communities. So I'm really inspired by your work. I think you're off to a terrific start. And I've been asked to share a few perspectives, largely from a state-centered one. And so I don't want it to come across as too provincial or parochial, but I will share a perspective from a state that is and will be deeply affected by the work and implementation of this plan, as well as a perspective from a state fish, wildlife, and parks agency and how we plug into these efforts and kind of see this plan taking shape. Just as a point of departure, geographically, obviously, we're situated at the southern terminus of the Great Plains, and our state is juxtaposed by 10 or 11 different ecoregions, depend upon how the ecologists define it, but we're bound to the north by the southern terminus of the Great Plains, or the southern shortgrass prairie ecoregion. In our southernmost reaches, we're at the northern extraliminal parts of the Tamaulipan thorn scrub ecoregion. To the west, of course, is the Chihuahuan Desert, and the east is the Gulf Coast prairies and marshes in the Gulf of Mexico. And really, with few exceptions, grasslands, which comprise roughly 60% of our state, are really the predominant ecological component on most of our landscape. And so they play really a disproportionate role for us biologically, ecologically, culturally, historically. They're a critical part of our heritage, our identity, who we are as a state, our people, where we've come from, where we're going, but also the economy of our state. And as we think about the context of grasslands and their future in Texas and the surrounding area, it's important to remember that in our area, 95% of the state is owned by private landowners. So consistent with most of the states up the central United States, the predominant stewards are private landowners. And that's a critically important part of this that a lot of the other speakers have mentioned, and which we are very, very focused on here. Whether it's an artifact of a accident of geography or the scale and size of our state, we're blessed with fairly bountiful and diverse grassland resources. And that's true whether we're talking, floristically or botanically, or more faunal related diversity. And we're mindful not only of the important role that we as a state, we as citizens, we as an agency play in the stewardship of the fish and wildlife resources that reside within the confines of our boundaries, but also the important role that we play from a transboundary perspective, and our role continentally. And that's true whether it's the bottleneck on the flyway for monarch butterflies and other pollinators, or the important role our grasslands play in different parts of the life cycle for a wide variety of our most, quintessential and iconic grassland birds, from, bobolinks and dicksizzles to loggerhead shrikes and bobwhite quail, and so forth. So we understand just how important the stewardship that happens here and the implications it has on, again, bird conservation as a whole. I think it's important as we think about this plan and what we want to accomplish that, we also have to remind ourselves it's not all blue skies and bluebonnets out there. And when we think about the grasslands, at least in our little corner of this, they're challenged. We've lost roughly 40% of our grasslands. The Blackland Prairie, which is an ecoregion which extends just east of San Antonio and runs due north on a line east of Austin and Dallas, less than a fraction of 1% of that historic native grassland now exists. And what does still exist here is found in tiny little prairie patches, of which roughly 10 to 12% are conserved in some form or fashion. The remaining grasslands that we have, which are obviously fairly extensive, are also influenced by a wide variety of factors. And so, how we think about rangeland health and rangeland degradation, and the causes and influences of either grassland loss or decline is critically important. And, certainly they're well known. And that's, whether we're talking about the conversion of grasslands to, croplands, or improved pasture, brush encroachment, the absence of fire suppression, the proliferation of these pernicious, invasive, and exotic species, which are having such a negative impact on our grasslands and other habitats. Fragmentation, urbanization is also a significant issue in our state. So these threats are real on the landscape, and our plans need to be aligned around specific measures to help try to address them. Jerome and others, talked about this really from more of a national perspective, but we're very fortunate here in Texas to have a wide array of very talented, dedicated, committed conservation partners at the federal and state and local and private and NGO and private sector related levels. Biggest challenge that we all face when it comes to grassland conservation, specifically in the state, are really twofold. One, working at scales that really matter ecologically and can have a meaningful impact. And then secondly, having sustainable resources to be able to draw upon to help support the critical work that needs to be done. And whether it's the kind of research that Dr. Boyle was talking about, or the more habitat specific management actions that we need to make sure are happening on the ground to achieve the desired results that we want to accomplish. Bar none, the most successful grassland conservation related initiatives and work in our state really can be defined by the successful engagement with private landowners working collaboratively in a non-regulatory, voluntary partnership, oftentimes incentive-based approach. And those same projects and initiatives are also delivering very tangible, very specific, very measurable outcomes that matter both to the landowners and to the conservation community, so that they're ones that, again, we can see and measure and know that they're contributing to specific desired conservation outcomes. And so, and that's true whether we're talking about the terrific work that NRCS is doing across our state on Farm Bill related programs, or the work of the Oaks and Prairies Joint Venture and their Grassland Restoration Incentive Program, or GRIP program, which is focused on restoring over 3 million acres of priority grassland habitats across Texas and Oklahoma, or more targeted geographic specific related efforts that are in place, say in landscapes like the Refugio-Goliad Prairie and the work that the Grazing Lands Conservation Initiative and others are doing, or the emerging work there in the Pecos River watershed to help address specific desert related grasslands. In thinking about the plan, that's really kind of the backdrop or the lens in which I'm approaching this, thinking about, again, our state-specific place in this. The role of a state fish and wildlife agency is just one of the many partners that are helping to row the boat or pull the sled, but also thinking about specifically that private lands context. Big picture, 30,000 foot view. I love the concept of a unifying, compelling, well-articulated vision for the future of our grasslands. We've been missing that, and it's needed to help remind all of us why it's so important and why it matters to all of us. And I would encourage the team to think a little bit more, work a little bit more deeply about that part about why grasslands matter so much. Everybody ought to have a connection to them, as I think Jerome said so eloquently. I'm inspired by the inclusivity of the sectors and people across the landscape. I think by and large, we're focused on the 8 sectors that have the potential to play and make the biggest impact or difference on grasslands. Again, whether that's from a research or a partnership or a policy decision maker, or the kind of boots on the ground where the rubber hits the road. I think the appropriate focus at this juncture on how we make sure that we're building trust, how we're working collaboratively, how we're ensuring that there's an active dialogue, again, are important hallmarks of a good plan and have to be the foundation for what's ahead. So what's missing? Where does the plan, in my estimation, need some additional emphasis? And so, I offer this in a constructive, certainly not a caustic fashion. I recognize that we're still, some ways, in the formative stages of this, and this plan is designed to be iterative and adaptive and ever evolving, which also I think is critical. Like Dr. Boyle, recognizing again where the plan is on the development continuum. I think my initial interpretation was that the plan was more aspirational as opposed to actionable. And so going forward, I hope that we can kind of work on those elements of the plan. Specifically, and again, from a state agency perspective, I'm going to be the most interested on where the rubber hits the road. What are those on the ground conservation practices that can be put in place to restore, enhance, and preserve priority grassland habitats? And that element of prioritization that Dr. Boyle mentioned, again, I think is critical as we think through this, because while we certainly want to be inclusive and we want to be focused on the entirety of the landscape, we're going to have to pick priorities, and we need your help in doing that. And we need to focus on what are those key threats to the priority grasslands. And so how are we going to implement specific practices to address them? How are we going to scale up things, and whether it's prescribed fire or the control or management of exotic or invasive species, or how we amplify research that needs to be replicated or expanded. The scale is gonna matter. I'll poach one of my favorite lines from Aldo Leopold, and that is that stewardship takes stewards. And in this landscape, 80% of the lands are owned and managed by private landowners. And so while all of us play an important role in this, I think we have to place a significant emphasis on how we successfully and voluntarily engage our private landowner partners and stewards in this. And I think the plan to date speaks to that in many different places. So I find that very laudable. But we have to keep reminding ourselves about how we take that a step further, and how we emphasize why landowners should engage with this plan. Why should they perceive this as an asset and not a threat or a liability? We're going to need them, all of them, when it comes to the implementation of the stewardship on the ground, but also at the policy related levels. And so how we successfully engage our partners at the National Cattlemen's Beef Association or the Farm Bureau or state livestock associations is going to be really important, so that we can help ensure the success of this program and keep the spirit of the voluntary related approach of this plan. One element that I found missing from the plan to date was any real speaking to any land conservation related strategies, and that I hope that we can draw upon the successful work of the partnerships for rangeland trusts, and that are working effectively in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, California, other places with their rancher partners, how we successfully affect working lands conservation, how we permanently protect, again, priority grassland habitats and associated biodiversity in partnerships with private landowners on a voluntary basis. So the land trust community, and particularly I think the partnership for rangeland trusts is one that I would look to for some additional help on the plan's development. The last area that I would encourage us to think about, and Matt, I think you referenced this in an exchange with Dr. Boyle, is that this plan isn't happening in a vacuum. There's terrific work that's already going on. There's some really good plans that are already out there that address elements of the needs in these plans, and that's true whether it's the work of the joint ventures, particularly those that are working on all bird related approaches, the state wildlife action plans. Let's make sure that we draw from those existing plans and don't recreate the wheel with respect to defining metrics and elements of success. Last but not least, Tammy asked us to share some insights on thoughts about other areas maybe tomorrow that the work group could work on. And so I'll share this at the risk of being presumptuous, but to offer these suggestions. The first one would be, again, to be thinking through very thoughtfully the elements of delivery, where the rubber hits the road. How are we going to deliver the metrics and specifics of this plan to be able to accomplish our big picture goals and objectives. And then last but not least, we need to be clear with each other about what success looks like. If this is a roadmap, where are we going? What's the final destination? And do we have clarity on that? And how do we know when we're getting closer or further to our measures of success? And lots of elements there to unpack from an ecological, a biological a perspective, as well as a human value related perspective. But I just want to make sure that we've thought through those things very, very carefully. Speaking from my colleagues in Texas, we're excited to be a part of this plan. We're honored to be asked. We're inspired by the vision. We deeply appreciate the engagement across the entirety of this landscape and the work across countries as well. And so we look forward to continuing to support this effort going forward. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Carter. Really appreciate it. Lot to think about and consider. And just as a note to the attendees, we are working hard during this session to take notes so that we can have a summary prepared for everybody to review, because clearly we're getting a lot of great things to think about and to consider. That concept of what are the real actionable items that you brought up, Carter. I think thinking about the priorities tomorrow and what's going to be really tangible to jump in on is perfect. So we're working fast to capture everything to get that out to all the attendees before the end of the day as well. So thank you. I do want to hand it over to Leslie Allison. And I know folks are probably looking at our clock. We are packing it in today. So we're going to keep moving forward and hear from as many folks as we can. And so Leslie, if you're ready, I'd love to have you jump in.
I am, and I'll go ahead and share my screen here really quickly. Let me know if that works. You have that now?
Yep, we have that now. If you just go into presentation.
There you go.
Perfect. You're good to go.
All right. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this and the opportunity to review this roadmap. You all have done great work in assembling all of the different pieces together. I'll give you a little background. I'm Leslie Allison. I'm the director of the Western Landowners Alliance. I'm going to just share some of these slides for context. They're not informational slides, just to remind us of what we're working for. Western Landowners Alliance is a West-wide landowner-led organization dedicated to keeping working lands whole, healthy, and economically viable. As landowners and managers, we take very seriously the privilege and the responsibility of caring for the land, wildlife, and resource values. We believe this isn't just the right thing to do, but it's also the necessary thing to do. Conservation has to be the foundation of how we do business, quite simply because if we don't take care of the land, it can't take care of us. And if we don't maintain biodiversity and ecological health, we impoverish and imperil ourselves. At the same time, there's an economic reality to working lands. Family farms and ranches need to be able to stay in business and to be successful conducting business in a manner that also supports wildlife, healthy soils, clean water, and a decent quality of life for people who steward the land. Landowners and managers have a unique perspective that is shaped by the lived experience of owning and managing land, of being engaged in the life of the land on a daily basis, and of having to be pragmatic in the way that we do this. We care very much, for example, about conserving wildlife habitat and healthy soils, and we also worry about things like market prices, the rising costs of health insurance for our families and our employees, the difficulty of finding and affording qualified labor, and the challenges of succession, to name a few. The truth is, it's very expensive to own and manage land, and the price of land is increasingly out of alignment with the ability of land to support a reasonable livelihood. Most landowners recognize that macro forces are pushing us in the wrong direction. We watch the land sales and subdivisions all around us with heavy hearts. This is happening for a multitude of reasons, but the key takeaway here is that unless we can find economic drivers that support working lands and good stewardship, we'll continue to see these lands and the ecological values they provide disappear. So in our work at Western Landowners Alliance, we focus on what we call the foundations of stewardship. It's not enough to want to do the right thing. To manage land well, to keep it healthy and intact, land managers must have three things. We need the knowledge and the science to support our decision making. We need adequate resources, including money and labor. We need supportive public policies. We are often missing one or even all three of these things. The Grasslands Roadmap is heading in the right direction with respect to these foundations. Importantly, the delegates have also identified the crucial need for holistic, collaborative, and flexible approaches to finding solutions. I think you've done a remarkable job of synthesizing the common ground values, principles, and priorities. You've also asked for specific feedback to the roadmap at this stage, and I would offer the following. On the priorities and partnership, we agree that local collaborative efforts are essential, but these collaborative efforts often struggle to survive for lack of funding. One recommendation could be to encourage funders and policymakers to better support collaborative conservation capacity, particularly within rural communities. If this was done anywhere near on par with the funding invested in large urban-based organizations, we'd be miles ahead. These collaboratives often do work on behalf of federal agencies, knitting projects together across agency silos and in the absence of adequate agency staffing. However, the decision-making authority within agencies, coupled with high rates of turnover, limit the ability of collaborative groups to succeed. We recommend creating decision-making structures and processes that better empower local collaboration. On developing a unified voice around the importance of grasslands, it would help greatly if we could promote agreed upon science concerning the effects of grazing on grassland ecosystems, climate, and biodiversity. The misinformation and bad science being spread on these topics is detrimental to our ability to generate public support and good public policy. On developing an extension bureau for speakers and trainers, this is a good idea, but knowledge sharing should not be all top down. Landowners and managers have years, decades, and lifetimes of hands-on knowledge and experience, but few opportunities to share this on a peer-to-peer basis or to inform academic research and science. There are countless discoveries and innovations taking place every day on working lands, but too often, if the practitioner doesn't have a PhD, that knowledge goes almost nowhere beyond that particular farm or ranch. So we need more opportunities for that lateral and two-way knowledge exchange. One thing that jumped out at me, you asked about things that might make us mad. A lot of conservation groups say that they want to teach landowners and managers that conservation is in their own best interest. This, under certain circumstances, can be pretty offensive to people who spend their lives actually managing land and trying to juggle the multitudes of needs and goals that this entails. It can come across as a kind of colonial attitude. I was on a call not long ago where some sportsmen were saying exactly that, not realizing that the landowners that they were speaking about in that landscape and their managers were PhD ecologists, masters in biology, all kinds of very well-educated, thoughtful people who are working hard to do those very things. In many cases, the people saying this actually have less knowledge and experience of ecology, agriculture, and natural resource management than the people they think to educate. So I would just say, please be careful in making assumptions about people's knowledge and motivations, and recognize that education does need to be a two-way street when it comes to land management. Under priorities for policy, the National Grasslands Conservation Act would just recommend that any such act closely adhere to the principles of local flexibility and collaboration. The notion of federal overreach has become a great concern to many landowners, as well as to local and state governments. National goals and sideboards and funding can help drive successful conservation, but the implementation cannot be a one-size-fits-all, and those who are directly affected on the ground have to have a real voice in decision-making and be able to benefit from these efforts. A National Conservation Act, if it happens, should be bipartisan and should have the buy-in and participation of state and local partners and landowners. Priorities for funding. There are many good priorities you've identified already in the roadmap. You might consider expanding on the potential to develop ecosystem services markets and the need to create real economic drivers rather than just conservation funding, which will never actually meet the scale of the need. I would also say that most ranches still depend on and will continue to depend on income from livestock production. And in order to keep working grasslands intact, the economics of family ranching have to work, which means there needs to be competitive markets for their products, a supply chain that supports local food systems, and a consumer base that values real, sustainably produced food and fiber. There needs to be a holistic look at the economics of sustaining grasslands, including conservation funding, markets, and the cost of production that include things like labor and health insurance, which are very real factors in what happens to these grasslands. We strongly agree with the need to fill gaps in personnel. Conservation doesn't happen without partnerships, collaboration, and people with boots on the ground to put it all together. We made a trip to DC not too long ago to discuss this need. We went there with some of the joint venture partners. And one of the things we heard was an idea that that some people would like to bypass what they called middlemen and just put money directly in the hands of farmers and ranchers. But most of us who work out on land or work with landowners understand that you really do need the people that make these partnerships happen, that leverage resources into landscapes. Landowners, farmers and ranchers are too busy out there working their day job to try to put all those pieces together. So we really do need that collaborative capacity and partnership. Priorities in research and evaluation. Your priority number one, information sharing is great and very important. I would just say it touches on but doesn't go far enough to addressing data sharing. Conservation efforts, species status assessments, and public funding should all be data driven. However, private landowners are naturally protective when it comes to collecting and sharing data about their lands. There are some data sharing solutions that work, but they are limited in scope, and more could be done to facilitate safe and confidential data sharing that protects landowner privacy while helping inform conservation efforts, particularly around imperiled species. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this tremendous effort and to be able to share these comments and perspectives on behalf of the Western Landowners Alliance.
Leslie, thank you. Really appreciate it, and definitely want to capture some of the very specific ideas that you posed. One that resonated early on for me with the talk was kind of the call out to funders and the investment that could be made in some specific areas. So thank you for that. We'll work to elevate that and have a number of those talking points in our conversations tomorrow with the work group. So again, thank you for your time and being here today. We really appreciate it. And we want to hand it over to Tutta Libby Cruz, and she has actually, to build on some of the ideas that Leslie just talked about as well, she has a video that we are going to play, and if our video producer can play that now, that would be great. Just the volume on that, Sebastian. You're on mute.
I'm Tutta Libby Cruz with Ute Creek Cattle Company, and I'm in the Partnerships and Engagement Group of the Roadmap. Jack and I live in northeastern New Mexico in the village of Huelleros, population 4. We're 47 miles from a gallon of milk in any direction. I love the land, and my mantra is the Native American proverb, we do not inherit the land, we borrow it from our children. Today, I'm sharing some highlights about land restoration at Ute Creek Cattle Company. Now, I don't mean to whine, but 2020 has been a really rough year. Out here in New Mexico, we say, agua es vida. It means water is life, and that is truth. We live by the water, as our country is arid and very drought prone. We had 3 inches of rain in the first 6 months of the year. Every day this spring, we were whaled by 30 to 40 mile an hour winds and 100-degree temperatures. Things were grim, and then it got worse. COVID showed up and threw everything in the country upside down. Jack and I continue to hunker down and shelter in place at home, where we've taken social distancing to an art form. Finally, the rains came in late June, and by the end of July, we had 7 inches of rain. And the grass is growing and everything's green and looks really pretty. Jack told me the rain has sure improved my disposition too. We landowners are a tough bunch. We gotta be tough to stay in business. My family's been on the land for almost 200 years. 20 years ago, after both my parents died, the ranch was split up and I inherited 1/5 of the large operation. There were 4 large pastures, 8 wells, and 10 miles of Ute Creek severely infested with salt cedar. The range had bare ground, wild Hereford cows, and no working pens. To begin land restoration, we designed an adaptive rest and rotation grazing system. 2 large storage tanks and 20 miles of pipeline on gravity flow system delivered water to 26 permanently fenced pastures. We restored the riparian area on 10 miles of Ute Creek and built a set of low-stress Temple Grandin design corrals. Good genetics and culling upgraded the herd into high-quality Angus cows. Collaborating with the Fish and Wildlife Partners Program, I'm proud of the 23-acre Tutalibby Cruz Wild Bird Sanctuary created here in Boyeros. Its fence provides water, food, berry bushes, a small grape arbor, and breeding and nesting habitat for grassland birds. The ranch-wide conservation practices increased the bird species count from 17 in 2004 to over 100. The bird species count is the yardstick we use for measuring land health. I gotta tell you folks, land restoration is a lot harder than you'd think. It takes a lot of resources and time, often years, to measure results. The most effective practices we used for increasing wildlife, forage, and soil health was the adaptive grazing system and water development to make it work. Please understand, we could not have done this without collaborating with NRCS and 15 other partnership entities that we worked with. And I always acknowledge them with deep gratitude because we could have never done this without their support. I can tell you, it is a fact, collaborative conservation gets work done on the land. I was also asked to share my thoughts on the roadmap. And first, I acknowledge that leadership is driving this effort. Interestingly, the true hallmark of leadership is empowering others to lead. I am awestruck by this proactive, massive scale undertaking led by Tammy Vercotteren and the amazing team at the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies and all of their awesome and diverse partners. It's really quite something, and I thank you. It's just an incredible thing to be a part of and to watch evolve. I'm looking forward to it. From my perspective, I envision finding a way to identify landowners, men and women who are community influencers, and designating them as major players in the roadmap project. As practitioners, they understand wildlife habitat needs, and as influencers, they have connections in the communities. Early on, they could be inviting neighbors over for a cup of coffee around the kitchen table and engaging in conversation and becoming part of the solution. I also see this as an opportunity to place landowners, both men and women, in leadership roles. It's time for that to happen. Generationally, privately owned working lands have cared for habitat, water, and soil, and it's been taken for granted that landowners bear that burden without acknowledgement or compensation. Perhaps it's time landowners were acknowledged and rewarded for their contributions to ecosystem health. We do know this: if private landowners are not economically sustainable, that land can become housing developments. I think the roadmap could encourage promoting conservation easements as a valuable tool for protecting landscapes. Every year, the West loses 276,000 acres of land to housing developments. That means every 4 years, over 1 million acres of land is lost, and it's irreversible. State land trusts are also a tool for preserving landscapes. To improve habitat, they offer incentives and conservation solutions to ranchers, farmers, and energy producers. I think we all need to accept that we must adapt to a warmer climate, and that'll continue to challenge grassland management for years to come. We also need to explore opportunities for partnering. There's a new, large, corporate-sponsored grasslands restoration project focusing on the northern Great Plains to mitigate effects of climate change through cattle grazing. I believe the future holds many more opportunities for collaboration with corporate America. I think the roadmap would be wise to address economic vitality in rural villages and towns. Young men and women are moving to urban areas, causing rural economies to evaporate. Sometimes there are no jobs, and sometimes they are not asked to stay because the family ranch or farm is not financially sustainable to support more family members on the land. Either way, we need to find ways to draw young homesteaders back to rural communities to raise their families and keep the schools open. Responding to outmigration could also raise awareness for housing and to encourage small business startups. Let me give you an example. In remote Harding County, we are 1,126 square miles in size, and that's a large landmass. We have 45,000 head of cattle and around 700 people. We have more mountain lion than people, and the average age is 62. And Harding County is a nationally accredited Main Street community with a 19-mile-long cultural district that includes the 3 villages of Roy, Solano, and Mosquero. In the last 4 years, a microbrewery and 7 new businesses have started up. Over the past 5 years, 12 young families with children have returned home to live, and some brought their businesses with them. Harding County Main Street is opening a small business incubator in the old Solano gym. And last fall, before COVID, Mosquero schools offered online education and increased enrollment to 79 students. That was very exciting to have that many students enrolled at school again. I think the bottom line is to manage holistically under a very large umbrella. We can communicate and collaborate. With creativity and innovation, we can all do a better job. I personally believe the Grasslands Roadmap is a win-win for birds, agriculture, and for rural America's sustainable future. Just remember, folks on the land hold the key to the outcome. Men and women on private lands are the keystone species we depend on to make the roadmap work. Guided by the Native American proverb, here at U Creek Cattle Company, we plan to stay on the land. Jack and I have borrowed the land from our children, Libby and Ted, and we're leaving it better than we found it. And when we pass on, Libby and Ted shall borrow the land from their children, Bella, Bennett, and Seth, and they'll do the same. This way, I believe we can keep the land in the family for the next 200 years. I sure hope so. Well, my friends, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you for listening. It's been my pleasure, and I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it, and really value a number of the points about collaboration that you had in there, and a number of things that you really need to be thinking about. I think there's some affirmations in there as well for what's been elevated in the roadmap. So thank you again for your thoughts and your work going into thinking about this, and also participating in the work groups last week and tomorrow as well. I am watching time, and I think we will switch things up a little bit as we move into the panel section. So if the panelists can be kind of ready to be on their toes, that will be helpful. And I do want to close our speaker portion with Monica, who's back with us. She's been a huge help in leading a number of the panels, giving a talk herself, and doing our opening land acknowledgement back on July 9th. So again, Monica, just really want to extend our gratitude and appreciation for your work that's gone into this. And I was thinking, just in terms of flow today, if Nick, who spoke as well earlier in the speaker sessions in July, if he's ready to go and add any thoughts after you give your talk, Monica, that would be great. So without further ado, Monica, if you want to jump in, love to hear from you.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen real quick. Can you hear me okay? I'm gonna cut this a lot shorter because we're running out of time, but I just would quickly introduce myself. My name is Monica Turkelson. I am with the World Wildlife Fund, and I serve in the capacity of Tribal Community Liaison, and I work specifically on the Pine Ridge Reservation here in southwestern South Dakota. I just wanted to reference some information from a book, Black Elk Speaks, where he talks about a time when the Lakota people, who we are, were connected to the land and to all that there was, and that there was a hoop, or the circle was continuous. He also in that book talks of the time when the Hooper Circle was broken, and that was broken through illegal taking, private ownership created, our reservations, reserves, boarding schools, BIA trust responsibility, policies, and oversight. And it becomes really important to talk about those histories and what has happened. But it's also important for us to talk about that we are still here. We're ever resilient with memory. I hear a lot of individuals always saying, you know, we're the 5th generation or the 6th generation. This is my grandson at a protest march, and he says, I'm the 200th generation on this land. Today, we're federally state recognized with a lot of Bureau of Indian Affairs managing our lands through trust responsibility, and that's through policy and funding, which includes natural resources and the grasslands and stuff. And I think it's really important for me to mention that, because as we move forward in the roadmap, we need to be able to understand how to work within Indian country and establish necessary partnerships to make sure that Indian country is part of that roadmap. So we bring to you Faith Spotted Eagle. I'm just going to touch on a couple of her things. She was an individual, a grassroots organization, the Braveheart Society, that really talked about what she is doing in her landscape. And what was unique about this is it's a grassroots organization, so that we can work with grassroots organizations in Indian country. It doesn't have to be the sole Bureau of Indian Affairs or the tribe. A lot of times I ask entities what they're doing, who they're working with, and they'll throw out a name of a tribe. And I always say, you know, what I want to hear is that you're working with members of tribes. We always seem to have some sort of redlining or something like that happening. And this is something Faith is doing. She's creating a bioregion, cultural and historical assessments and analysis on that land. She hopes to eventually create a 150-mile stretch of the Missouri River, which is part of her original homelands, to create that bioregion and then to create a management tool that she can do that as a Dakota person. So it was really important for her to share place, that we need to really understand that she is really a part of that area, that her soul is part of that. And that's something that we need to really understand, is that we are part of that place. And as I read the roadmap and the priorities, I heard that the word inclusivity, I heard that over and over, and I was glad to see it in there. And so I put that in there, that was something that she wanted to do. We had Nick Hernandez, who is also on here, brand new 501c3. So again, it's another organization or entity working in Indian country that entities can work with, that we need to partner with. He works on food and land systems, regenerative agriculture. And again, he talked about inclusivity of tribes. Nick said, don't gray out the reservation land areas when we're looking at the roadmap. So, you know, I really thank him for making that comment. We bring Wayne and Alex Frederick to you, who are doing business as Res Raised, young entrepreneurial company, doing grass-fed, working with Bureau of Indian Affairs policies now. They talked about their organic, trying to go organic, and it didn't really make sense to them. And that they're combining traditional ecological knowledge with modern policies. And in their market and growth, they talked about expanding into bison as well, and operating cattle at the same time. But really, they were looking at restoring a lot of their land, just as Faith was. And again, the words that came forward in that was inclusivity, that we can work with individual tribal members, and we don't need to redline or gray out those reservation lands, and we can reach into the reservations and work with tribal members. There are people like, well, Wayne and Alex, who are doing work there. I bring to you Emily Boyd-Falandra, a biologist. This is a tribal program. Almost all reservations have tribal programs that they work within that are doing a lot of conservation planning for their areas. Again, we want to look at partnerships, state, tribal. She also mentioned that she's on the Sustainable Financing Initiative for tribal wildlife programs, and that she has federal partners. So my question and her question was, who is missing in that partnership realm, and who can work with our tribal reservation programs that are helping to do conservation and are working in the wildlife area, as well as ranching and working with all stakeholders that are utilizing the ground. So grassland priorities. I looked at a lot of the words in there too that that was written in there. And again, I seen that word inclusivity. I seen the word treaty, and I was really happy to see treaty recognition, that word was put in there. Engagement of tribal members, producers, tribal programs, private 501c3 entities, and grassroots organizations. That these are all entities and individuals that can be worked with, that should be worked with, and that are part of the roadmap and need to be considered. I've seen the word equitable, establishing partnerships with all the different voices. And again, as everybody has said, the boots on the ground, the ones doing the work. And as Nick said, no graying out of the reservation lines, include them, be inclusive, and no redlining. We've seen this with a lot of investment. We always say that for some reason, investments stop at the reservation borders, and we need to not do that. We need to cross those borders, come in and establish those partnerships and have equitable investments as well. Land acknowledgement. We always say, we are of the earth, we are part of the root nation. We are of the grass, we're the buffalo nation. We are part of the circle and working to mend our hoop. We are the indigenous voices, and we're really glad to have brought those forward to you and to have shared those. And we just ask that we continue to be included in that, and don't be afraid to reach into the reservations and partner with individuals, with tribal programs, and with tribes themselves. So with that, I guess, I can end it there and say that that's what we're really looking at as Indigenous people, is include our voice and partner with us, and let's establish some equality and equitable practices in the Indian country. With that, Matt, I will keep it short and try to the point. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Monica. That was excellent, and we will definitely again take those notes in your PowerPoint too and add those to our summary for the day. And I noticed that there was some affirmation of some of the things we've heard from the speakers that has gone into the new draft of the roadmap already. But I just want to elevate that we have much more to do. That's only the first step, and there are other details and things to hear from those speakers to still get in there. So thank you for that summary. And Nick, who you mentioned in your talk, Nick Hernandez from Macoche Agriculture is here today. Nick, I don't know if you wanted to jump in, if you had anything else to add, a question to pose to delegates or something to think about. And as we sort of move into the panelist phase, there's no obligation here, but I want to make space for panelists to offer something here. So Nick, did you have anything you wanted to add to Monica's summary and talking points there?
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can. Thank you.
Yeah, well, good afternoon, good morning. My name is Nick Hernandez. I'm the founder and president of Macoche Agriculture Development. And Macoche in my Lakota language means homelands. And it seems, relatively connected when we're talking about, our connection to our homelands, and our connection to our, past, present, and future generations. Is basically how we live in this world. But in listening to a lot of the speakers and stuff talk about their connection to the land, their history, there's always generations before those who steward the lands and stuff. And the one thing about indigenous native country is that we're talking about generations of stewardship that existed before modern ideas. And so that's one thing with the roadmap to look at, is not only the inclusivity, but also that understanding that there was many generations that stewarded the land before that, but also understanding the modern identification. Because when I was talking about the graying out and stuff of reservation lands, there's no data, there's no contact, there's no information related to those. I know it's a roadmap that's being developed, but on your modern Western road maps, if you have those places, those are kind of your barren, barren areas. And when we talk about reservations, I mean, alone there's 31 plus reservations just within the Great Plains. You know, those are modern, those are modern Western encampments right now, what are reservations. And so it's just, acknowledging that stuff, but also acknowledging that, there's a lot of stewardship going on those lands. And so including those, including those perspectives, those lands, especially if we're talking about the Great Plains. I mean, we're talking about one of the largest migratory pathways from North and South America that exists today. So, I mean, that's kind of my addition for some of the stuff we've previously talked about, but also some of the stuff that Monica presented. Because when we talk about land, we're talking about water, we're talking about the air, we're talking about migratory patterns. So no, those are kind of the understanding. So thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Nick. And again, we really appreciate you joining us today and for your talk a couple weeks ago as well. So thanks for being here. We want to open it up. We have Maria Alfaro and Elena Roderte, and we wanted to open it up for them for a couple minutes to hear any perspectives. I know they're coming in the midst of a lot of speakers here, so just want to give you a moment, Elena and Maria. And Maria, or Elena, excuse me, spoke a couple weeks ago as well, so it's great to have you back. So Maria and Elena, did you want to add anything, pose any questions? We've got a minute or two at this point as we work through our panelists. So any questions you wanted to pose or things that you wanted to highlight that you're not seeing in the roadmap so far?
Bueno, básicamente me gustaría comentar el trabajo que hacemos dentro del área de los pastizales centrales. Nosotros somos representantes, está mi compañero también Carlos Cifuentes, que es director de la región noreste y Sierra Madre Occidental de la Comisión Nacional de Áreas Naturales Protegidas. Los dos estamos atendiendo estas reuniones, pero sí quisiera dejar claro que la Comisión Nacional de Áreas Naturales Protegidas tiene la atribución de administrar las áreas protegidas federales. Dentro de la gran área de pastizales del centro de México, hay pocas áreas naturales protegidas. La mayor parte de esta superficie está fuera de áreas naturales protegidas y por lo tanto nuestro ámbito de acción se centra nada más en lo que es un área natural protegida, caso de la Reserva de la Biosfera Janos, lo que comenté la semana pasada, el área de protección de flora y fauna Maderas del Carmen, y tenemos actividades de monitoreo biológico, de trabajo con los dueños de la tierra, sobre todo con los ganaderos, ¿no? Entonces, la visión para México es más amplia, ¿verdad? Tendría que involucrar a otras instituciones federales, a instituciones del ámbito estatal y municipal, que son también quienes tienen atribuciones para el manejo y la conservación de los pastizales fuera de las áreas naturales protegidas, que es el caso de María Alfaro. Entonces, a mí realmente me parece que la visión es muy interesante, la visión del plan de ruta, sobre todo porque es una visión conjunta entre los países, es una visión colaborativa, se integra algo que nosotros hemos estado buscando como país, que es justamente el cambio de políticas públicas de los sectores agrícolas, ganaderos, incluso de la relación de la población indígena y campesina con relación a los pastizales. Para nosotros el trabajo que se plantea es más amplio, ¿verdad? Involucra a otros sectores de la sociedad. Nos queda una gran tarea a nosotros, ¿verdad? Entonces, consideramos que al plan de ruta le haría falta de alguna manera una visión más fuerte de estos otros sectores para el caso de México, ¿no? Entonces, es poco el tiempo, yo sé, ahorita ya estamos bastante apretados. Entonces, mis preguntas yo las haría básicamente en el chat, pero sí quería dejar claro cuál es la competencia de la Comisión Nacional de Áreas Naturales Protegidas, porque para la implementación del plan se necesita la interacción de otras dependencias federales y estatales, no solo de la Comisión. Es todo por mi parte.
Great, thank you, Elena. Yeah, and if we can post some of those ideas into the chat, that would be great. And Maria Alfaro will allow you to give you the space to do the same thing. And we're gonna jump over Diana from Tri-State. If you're ready to share any thoughts or perspectives, we haven't had a chance to hear from industry today. So any high-level questions or responses, what's missing in the roadmap right now? If you've got a minute, that would be great.
Hi, Madam Diana Liker. I am an environmental planner with Tri-State, and we serve rural communities in Colorado, New Mexico, Nebraska, and Wyoming. And I guess my main point is I just really appreciate the inclusion of industry in this discussion. I think all of the panelists and speakers made it very evident that having this collaborative effort that includes everybody is critical. So my main point on that is the electric industry is huge. There's hundreds of entities. And so I guess my thought is trying to leverage and engage different industry groups. Folks may be aware of the EV and Powerline Interaction Committee, also known as APLIC. It's a group of 70 plus wildlife biologists that work for utilities like myself. And we have research dollars available to address research questions pertaining to energy impacts. We also do a lot of outreach. And so I think the APLIC committee is a great way to reach a large number of members. In addition to that, there's the Western Utilities Group, which is made up of environmental professionals in the Western United States. And we work with the Forest Service and the BLM to kind of help develop policy to ensure we have sustainable development. And so I think that group could be very helpful in a policy development role. And then we're also part of the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, which pretty much represents every rural cooperative in the United States. And so they're also a really great group. If we want to try to engage as many people as possible and get the word out, I think kind of engaging some of these industry groups would be a really great way to kind of continue this conversation. So I just appreciate having a seat at the table and look forward to future collaboration.
Great, thank you, Diana. We appreciate your time today and joining us and adapting to our shifting plans here. And Jim Eckberg, I don't know if you wanted to add anything. You've been with us since the beginning with your talks and been involved in some of the work groups too. Anything to add from what you're seeing firsthand from the industry perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And I'll just add that, you know, as in listening to the discussion, so I'm Jim Eckberg. I'm a research agronomist with General Mills. And I just want to kind of emphasize that as we talk about grasslands, these grasslands really occur in a matrix of other landscapes. And if we, you know, want to be thinking truly about these working landscapes, I think we should be thinking more broadly about the grassland, not just as a single habitat, but as that broader region. I think the narrative kind of breaks down a little bit as we, you know, move further east, as we move into areas that have much more diverse landscape types. And we know that, you know, a lot of grassland species, or species we kind of call grassland species, they use non-grassland habitat. And so understanding this broader context of the landscape is one point. And how do we minimize the negative effects of those non-grassland habitats? For example, we've talked about regenerative, and regenerative agriculture, you know, stands with the research has been shown to virtually eliminate, you know, the use of insecticides, of fungicides, is what the literature suggests. And what will that mean for insect populations and fledglings that can use that habitat? So thinking more broadly is one thing I'd like to stress. And the other thing I want to kind of talk to is the importance of data-informed models. So as Jerome Ford was saying, you know, we can't have endless research studies that go on. I think we need to think how, as we start to think about these species, and we think about conserving populations of species? How do we reduce the risk that those species will go extinct? And how do we develop those models and inform those models with the best theory and the best on the ground data to inform conservation planning and practices? As Dr. Boyle was saying, you know, should we be preserving fragments of habitats or preserving whole habitats? And that is really context dependent question depending on the species we're trying to preserve. So I think that I'll end by saying that, you know, that the broader view of conservation, the broader view of thinking of conservation in non-grassland habitat is an and, it's not an or. It's not a subterfuge for justifying conversion of grasslands to agricultural landscapes. It's a way of thinking more broadly about the landscape and how do we develop these working landscapes that can really preserve not just grasslands, but grassland bird species. And I'll pass it back to you, Matt. And actually, I'll end with one more thing, which is to say that within the research evaluation team, there's a sustainability model that we would like to work on. I think that will be the context for talking about this more broadly. And I would really invite, some have reached out to me and we're making some really great connections. And I really invite others to see if we can come together and start talking about this and put this mark on the roadmap. But really great work so far, everyone, and really appreciate being part of it. Thanks.
Perfect. And thanks, Jim, for ending there, because I just want to elevate that as an example of how we're going to take the roadmap to the next step in terms of seeing one of the priorities on there and having a delegate, speaker, leader, and Jim helping to coordinate and bring some people together to form a task force or a work group ad hoc to talk a bit more about that and dive more in depth to it than we can during the work groups. It's a great example of where we're headed with this work with the work group. So thank you, Jim, for your work there. I want to go over to our friends from the foundations who are here. We have Seth from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, Justin from the Bobolink Foundation, Kevin from Sand County Foundation, and Nicole from the Knobloch Family Foundation. Really want to thank all of you for your time and your support of the overall project, of course, and then being here today as well. Given our limitation in time, wanted to see if a couple of you had some thoughts or ideas, questions that you want to elevate or raise to the delegates to consider. A quick hand raise that I can see, although I can't see all of you. Yeah, Nicole, do you want to jump in? That would be great.
Sure. I want to echo a couple of points from today, specifically from Alice Boyles, that we could use some more cross-sector collaboration and communication. I think in the funding community, we're really hungry for information that helps us make smart investments. And then to echo Carter Smith's point that a prioritized list of conservation opportunities would be a great ultimate product to come out of the roadmap, especially with respect to land conservation. And then to add a new point, you know, the roadmap really calls for greater collaboration and coordination, and I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think the funding community could also benefit from a bit more collaboration. And NIFWIF has really kicked that off with the Northern Grassland Business Plan as a successful model for that. We might also think about a model that's something like the Water Funder Initiative, a set of philanthropies that is sort of loosely aggregated to promote water markets. And I wonder if something similar would be helpful to organize philanthropic interest in grassland conservation. So just my 2 cents and something for the funding community to chew on.
Perfect, thank you, Nicole. Anybody else from the foundation sector? Yeah, Seth, thanks.
I'll just be very brief. There's so many speakers said great things that jumped off, and I have a whole list on the page. But one thing that really resonated with me was Jimmy Bramblett's comment about NRCS not being able to go it alone. And you know, if there was an agency or an organization that had the size and scope and capacity and access to resources to do it, it would be NRCS. And so to hear that sort of leadership through humility that this is bigger than any one entity is really important. And I hope it's something that participants and delegates will take to heart as we move down the road with the roadmap. With that said, as to be so bold, you know, NIFWIF, I think, is excited to be at the table, and we're a little bit different in the sense that we're not a traditional foundation, but really we are a conduit and a catalyst for public-private partnerships. And And it's exciting to see the size and scope and scale of interest from all the different sectors, and that we're just excited moving forward on this, and hope that we can continue to engage and develop something that's actionable.
Perfect. Thank you, Seth. Really appreciate your help today also as well through the whole process. I'd like to jump up to Terry and Dan and Martha, our state directors. We got to hear from Carter as well earlier, but based on his talk and some of the things he elevated, I wanted to see if any of you had some pieces to add here in our conversation. And I know we're getting here close to the end hour, but yeah, I want to offer some time to all three of you. Yeah, Terry, if you can jump in, thanks.
Thanks, Matt, and a great group of speakers. Tammy and Matt, you've done a fantastic job on this. I have about 3 pages worth of notes here from all of the speakers. Add a little levity to it. Jerome, you and I have had arguments on who grew up the forest anymore. That's not over with yet. But I think the important thing about the roadmap is the partnerships. If you forge a strong partnership, I think everything else falls into place. And sometimes they're very tough to. And Carter made some comments, a couple of them that really struck a chord with me. And this plan has to be agile. It's adapting and evolving as we go. I understand that, but as a famous general said, any plan is good until the shooting starts. So when we get out there and start implementing this, putting the boots on the ground, I think that's going to be when we have to be agile. And another thing that Carter said is, what does success look like? Is it preserving grasslands, or is it making sure those grassland-related species are going in the right direction? One of the things that we're dealing with in North Dakota, and no offense meant to the industry people, but we have about 25% of our native grasslands left. And some of those grasslands are very, very important, but through some developments, and I'm not talking very intrusive developments, but wind energy, they are reducing the grassland bird populations in some of those areas by upwards of 50, 60%. So the research, and that's in priority number 4 in research and monitoring. I think we need to look at that, and it's based on a peer-reviewed journal article. So again, no offense meant to it, not against wind energy at all. It's just, let's be careful and let's work together on that stuff. That's all we ask. Thanks again, Matt and Tammy. Great job.
Great. Thank you, Terry. Appreciate that. And I think we have some tough conversations when we get into this really complex collaborative environment where we have to really talk about some of those things and elevate those challenges. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Just want to offer again to all the panelists, we're over the 12 o'clock hour, but like the other sessions, we'll continue to run. If people are willing to stay on, this is all going to be recorded. And anything else you want to post in the chat can also be documented. So that's a great way to offer perspective. I know some people have their hand raised, so maybe we can go there, and we'll keep working through the different order speaker that we have right now. So Martha or Dan, did you want to jump in? Martha, I know you had taken it off mute for a minute, so if you want to jump in, that would be great.
Thanks, Matt. I just want to add, well, just remarkable work that's clearly the result of strong minds, good energy, and I have to say much needed momentum here. So whatever we can all do to keep that momentum going. And I believe, was it Carter talked about accountability to make sure we stick to our commitment. So on that, in that light, I just want to commit on behalf of Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. We're all in and really support the direction you're going, support the partnerships, research, evaluation, monitoring, and frankly, to continue putting our funding, directing our funding to where we can make a bigger difference, and the full suite of tools, whether it's conservation easements, long-term leases, seed cost sharing, other creative solutions, and just really appreciate the partnerships we've developed along the way, even this far. I do want to echo Robin's comment on that full collaboration coordination will require change in mindset. And I think for all of us to pay attention to that and give it our full support, and you certainly have mine. And as Jerome mentioned, the connection to people, we can't ever forget that. So all things other people have said, really appreciate the great work. Thanks, Matt.
Great, thank you, Martha. Really appreciate it. Thanks for your time and overall support. It's great to have that called out. Thank you. Director Prenslow, Dan, are you still on? I know we've gone past your...
Still on, but in essence of time, I'll just tell Tammy thanks. Good job, Matt, and glad to be a participant.
Thank you for being with us today. And again, any thoughts to add, feel free to put them in the chat, email them to me, and we'll get them into the record. Thank you. Hey, Mike from the American Bird Conservancy, wanted to go over to you. Thanks for being here today. And yeah, any thoughts you want to share, please do.
Yeah, thank you, Matt, and thanks, Tammy, and thanks, everybody. This has been a really tremendous panel and wonderful speakers and just great subject material. I've really learned a lot and enjoyed it a lot. I'll be very brief because I know we're over time. American Bird Conservancy really appreciates the opportunity to be involved in this and working with you all. The things that strike me are that a unified message is critical, and I think that recognizing and celebrating the role that traditional knowledge, ejidos, and ranchers play in grassland conservation is critical, and we want to do our part to build on that. We work a lot with ranchers, and both in the United States and with Pro Natura and other groups to our south. I think it's absolutely critical, and we've really enjoyed the opportunity to do that work. I also think that really focusing on full life cycle conservation for these species is very important. I also think that from the point of view of the roadmap, identifying some tangible next steps, even if they are, steps along the way to the bigger goal, would be really great to see things that we can do as the sum of the parts working together to accomplish some specific things to really build this and keep that momentum rolling would be super important. We would love to be part of it. We appreciate the opportunity to come. Thank you. It's an honor to be part of this really wonderful group. And I think that, you're doing terrific work here, and it's been really a pleasure to listen to. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. And yeah, I think one of the tangible ones I've heard in a number of talks today is that shared messaging, but how that relates to maybe a public campaign that goes out about the importance of the grasslands and these ecosystems. So I know that's one of the priorities in the partnership and engagement section, and it might be one of those first really tangible things for groups to work on. Grady, thank you for your patience. Love to go up and see what you have to add. Thank you again for being with us today, and yeah, take it away. Grady, you are on mute. I'm going to unmute you. There you go.
That's what I was doing there, so I'm unmuted.
Right.
Fantastic presentations. Just one point that I would highlight that was brought up from an academic perspective by Leslie. I'm sorry, by Alice, and from a landowner perspective by Leslie, is that knowledge on the ground, finding ways to feed that back to academia and research and establishing best practices. And Jimmy Bramblett pointed out something that I think speaks to that, and that is that managers on the ground make as a whole, make millions of decisions daily. And every one of those decisions is an opportunity to learn and find new ways that work to do things. In contrast to that, science, because in science you have to control things, scientists only get to make a few decisions in that context of control and getting data that is statistically relevant. So people on the ground, whether they're landowners or biologists on the ground participating in conservation, are really the reconnaissance crew. And I don't think the roadmap right now successfully captures that point. I think the place where it probably belongs is under the partnership and engagement guidance. Priority 1, include producers and land managers but that third bullet that says to recognize innovative strategies, and then it speaks to invasive species. I think that could be more generalized to recognizing innovative strategies in conservation that come from the bottom up. And the last thing I'd say is, as the process of building this roadmap goes on, right now there aren't really forums where those people that are on the ground get to interact with scientists. And in relation to the whole controversy about rotational grazing, I tried to do that. I tried to speak at in scientific venues, and it was difficult to get a voice there. And then when I did get a voice there, what I had to say was dismissed because it wasn't statistically significant data. It was temporal observations, which obviously don't establish causality. And lastly, Alice mentioned that we have to be able to open our minds on bones. I think people on the ground need to understand the importance of science, but also scientists need to be able to open their minds to innovation that happens on the ground.
Great, thank you, Grady. And I think that point about forums ongoing, I think that's part of what we're seeing emerge from the collaboration, the partnership and engagement section, that there's going to be opportunities because of this process for continued conversation to happen. And this is just the beginning of that. So thank you for elevating that. I think that's a great call out, among others, for us to consider. Really appreciate your time. Would like to go over to Rick Truex from the Forest Service and Cindy Buchanan from the Farm Service Agency. We haven't been able to hear from either of you today, and just wanted to check in with you, any points or questions to elevate. And Rick, we'll hop over to you.
Thank you, Matt, and thanks everyone. This is a really great session. I don't have too much more to add right now. An awful lot of good comments have been offered. One thing I will say, though, is that bringing these 8 sectors together is just critical for the success of this moving forward. There's obviously a lot of great work going on the ground right now, but pulling together these 8 sectors to think about the bigger picture is really important. And I would just offer that there may be some value in including just a really brief kind of paragraph or something in the roadmap about why these 8 sectors were identified and what they can bring to the table. They all offer different skills, different perspectives, different resources, et cetera. And I think having that kind of continuity and backdrop will help remind us why we're all in this. But I think, again, a great job coordinating this, and thanks to you and all the panelists and Tammy for putting this together.
Thanks, Rick. Appreciate that. Yeah, we have some work to do on the preamble of this for sure, and explaining those pieces. So thank you for bringing that up. That's a great point. Cindy, you got anything to add? Questions to pose?
Thank you for this opportunity. This is Cindy Buchanan, and I'm the Farm Program Chief in Colorado. And a couple of things that I wanted to point out is that have been mentioned throughout this whole panel, which has been great, is the priority area 3 and the identify opportunities to develop strategies and share. In Colorado, we have done a couple research projects, one with Virginia Tech and one with another organization, and that this is a good way that we can use to share data and help figure out what type of grassland should be planted on the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP as most people know it as their covers. And we are able to do some research and test plots on trying to figure out what works best for management activities or for planting and stuff like that. So that can be done in all states where they can we can do these research projects. And then I also wanted to say build stronger and private and public partnerships with the CRP program. It is a national volunteer program, but we do also within that program have a program that's called SAFE, which is State Acres for Wildlife Enhancement. And Colorado currently actually has 4 of these, and these 3 of them are in the Grasslands area, and it's a way to help develop special incentives in the general signups to allow contracts or offers that are being in that area get extra points for accepted offers. Now, these are not started by the state or from FSA standpoint, it's with our partners that create these SAFE programs that allow producers to get additional points, that allows them a better chance and opportunity to get into the CRP program. I did want to mention that in Colorado alone, we have 1,813,000 acres in CRP in just the state of Colorado alone, and only 72,000 of those acres are in safe acres. So of that 1.8 million, only 72,000 is really targeted towards wildlife concerns, major wildlife concerns in your grasslands and stuff. And we can definitely increase that by having more participation in those SAFE programs. And for this year, for the signups in 2020, we had 540,000 acres offered and or accepted, I should say. So besides that 1.8 million, we're going to be adding 540,000 acres this year. Again, only 16,000 of those acres are in the safe areas, which again, 3 of them are in the grassland area. So working with other states, or other states working with their partners and with you, maybe you can look at getting additional SAFE programs in different states to help increase that possibility. The other possibility that I thought about for partnering up is the national priority area, which would be working with the national office in Washington, D.C., where like there's a prairie pothole national priority area that's up north that specifies for the prairie pothole. I believe it's in Montana and North Dakota, and can't remember if it was in anything else. I know it's up on the northern arm. And then we have like the Chesapeake Bay national priority area. So if you turn the grasslands into a national priority area, then those CRP contracts would get additional points for offerings and put more land into grassland.
Great, thank you. Steve. Yep. I'm wondering if you could offer some of those notes. A lot of details there. I want to capture in the summary. That would be great.
Yes, I can give you a summary.
Perfect, thanks. And I want to go back up to Maria Alfaro. I apologize, we missed you a few minutes ago, and I know you were waiting patiently, so I want to head back up there, and then we're going to make space for other panelists to jump in as well. So Maria, you are on mute probably. Shoot, yeah, Maria, we're not able to hear Maria. I think this is what happened. Apologize. And Maria, are you in the Spanish channel? We haven't been able to hear you yet. And then Alejandro, if you're in the English channel, if you're interpreting. Great. Okay. Okay, well, we'll do that on the side. If we can pause for just a minute, and if anybody else wants to share, Maria, we'll come back over to you again before the end. Kevin McLeese and Justin Pepper, you graciously yielded your time. Wanted to just check in with you and see if you had anything else to add, and Noreen Walsh as well. I know we're at the end here, but just want to give you all space since you've taken the time and the thought energy to be with us today. So. Okay, Alejandro, are we ready to go? Okay. I think though we were at a close, so I'm wondering, hopefully we can capture some of Maria's thoughts and add those to the summary, since we're at that point in the day. I want to take a moment and just again thank everybody who joined today. Really appreciate your time, the energy you put into reviewing everything, those of you who are participating in work groups. Really appreciate having all these sectors here together, sharing all of your thoughts, adapting to our time and our schedule. And there's more to come. This is not the last moment, even once the roadmap is published. It's only a first draft, and we're going to spend some time over the next year working together on it, getting on to the more concrete action items, seeing what it looks like when we're on the ground working on it. So that's the great part about doing something iteratively and doing a cyclical learning process. We can continue to be innovative and create things as we go. So for those of you who didn't get a chance to talk as much today or have more ideas, please continue to contribute those. I also want to note that we did not have our closing land acknowledgement today, and that has been a really important part of this overall speaker process. And but Alice Boyle did something really important at the beginning of her talk that I want to highlight for people to do as we move further into these collaborative processes, which is, in the absence of a more formal land acknowledgement, just to take note of where you're broadcasting from or calling in from. And so for me, here in Colorado, we have over 48 tribes, nations, and pueblos that have called or call Colorado their home. Specifically in the Denver area, I'm in the Cheyenne and Arapaho Nation land, and just want to take that moment and compel everybody to find out, as Alice did, where you're calling in from, what land are you on, and to also do land acknowledgement in a personal way as well, in the absence of a formal one. And we hope that we can still do another formal one that we will post to the website at some point to create a nice closure there as well. Otherwise, I think we probably need to come to a conclusion today. And again, any of the panelists and speakers, anything to add, please email me, post things in the chat. We will get it documented and shared out. And that is our 4th session. Thank you, everybody participating. We're looking forward to the work groups tomorrow. A lot to tackle, a lot to think about, but we will get there. And it's great to have so many brilliant minds thinking about this and so much engagement and energy. Thank you again.